It started as a student protest.
But they had marches downtown.
The unrest turned violent.
And all hell's broke loose.
And the next thing I heard was that ping when you pulled a gas grenade.
That chaos is remembered as one of the most turbulent times in Kansas City.
You kind of hid in your house for fear of being shot.
Those days of unrest changed Kansas City forever. Welcome to Fox 4's KC Riots 50 years later. I'm Lauren Halifax.
And I'm John Holt. Tonight we're telling the stories of those who lived through the 1968 riots. We'll also be taking a look at how race relations in Kansas City have changed over the last 5 decades since the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And we begin with April 9th, 1968, a decision made by the Kansas City, Missouri School District to have classes on the day of Dr. King's funeral.
That led to protests and marches. Fox 4's Pat McGonigal shows you how that day then turned violent.
This is Lena Rivers Smith. I am in the intersection of 12th and Oak, where the crowd has gathered.
April 9th, 1968, when a peaceful protest outside City Hall in Kansas City took a violent, chaotic turn.
It's the type of thing when you live through you don't forget.
Kansas City Mayor Sly James had a front row seat to a troubled chapter in city history.
It was literally a block from my house, and it was several days, and there was a lot of upheaval. There were people afraid to leave their homes.
Unlike some other U.S. cities, the streets of Kansas City remained peaceful in the days immediately after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968.
Our violence was a little bit delayed in that regard.
But it was only delayed for 5 days. Classes were not canceled in Kansas City on the day of King's funeral, so high schoolers marched out of Paseo, Lincoln, and other high schools. Eventually, adults would join the march on 71 Highway leading up to KC City Hall. At first, it was tense but peaceful.
From 12th and Oak, Lena Rivers Smith, WDAF television.
And they marched to City Hall, and that's when they were met with police officers and tear gas. And that's when it started.
It was a scary event, to say the least.
It was a scene many thought could never happen in Kansas City, and when it was over, 6 African Americans were dead. Police arrested more than 1,000 people, and the damage to mostly black-owned homes and businesses totaled $4 million.
There was a tenseness in the air that was almost palpable. Yeah, I remember. Don't think I'll ever forget, to be quite honest.
Pat McGonigal on that fateful day 50 years ago tonight. A Kansas City man won't forget those days in April of '68. Clarence Gibson worked long hours as a police officer for KCPD during the riots. He'd been on the job less than a year when the unrest broke out.
We were about, I'd say 40, 50 cops, I think a couple, 3 bus loads. And we were standing there with our clubs in our hands holding down. And we were supposed to hold the crowd back. They can't come any further here. And I'm looking at the number of young folks who are coming down the street and a number of cops who's going to stop them. And I'm thinking, man, they could overwhelm us.
Gibson says the clashes with police outside City Hall started when someone threw a soda bottle toward the officers. It didn't hit anyone, but he says that's when an officer used tear gas on the marchers and things started getting out of hand.
Throwing all that gas at 12th and Oak was unnecessary. One silly bottle hits in front of us. And I wish you could go back in time and there'd be no gas thrown. What would have happened?
Gibson believes had Kansas City, Missouri public schools not held classes on the day of the funeral, there would not have been any unrest.
A lot of the rioting, the looting, the fires that were set in the following days, some say was a response to that, to police throwing the tear gas. What happened after that? How did white Kansas Cityans respond? Eric Wesson writes for Kansas City's longtime black newspaper, The Call. Here's his perspective. On April 9th, 1968, Eric Wesson sat in his elementary school 8 blocks away from high school students walking out of class. As those students protested, police attacked them with pepper spray and tear gas. Why would the cops respond with so much unnecessary force?
Because they could. You have to consider the culture in Kansas City was still, then it was like keep the black community oppressed. So it was probably the standard norm that's the way they responded to things. Things really here didn't really start noticeably changing a little bit probably until the 70s. There was still police that were here that were under the old regime where that was okay to just pull a black man out of the car and beat him for no reason at all.
I asked if he remembers the response of the white community.
I don't really remember there being an outspoken person from the white community saying, hey, stop that, you can't do that, you can't treat people like that. If there was any outrage or anything spoken about it, it was the black ministers. And they were very, very strong back then. A.L. Johnson, John W. Williams, Earl Abel, Reverend Hartsfield, Henderson Bell, those guys were a force to be reckoned with.
And in the months that followed, a shift started to take place.
The school district got a little bit better. I think during that period as well was when you were doing the desegregation from the schools. That got a little bit better. Blacks could buy houses in different parts of the town. It was still that housing segregation thing that was going on here. You could buy houses in different parts. The political structure changed a little bit. A few more blacks elected to office right after Dr. King's assassination. Black businesses kind of expanded out of that column or that aisle of where they could live at then.
He says he thinks it took something drastic to at least bring attention to the problem.
There was a good thing that came about it. It did, in fact, bring situations where we could talk about housing, we could talk about poverty, we could talk about education. I think it set the stage for that to happen.
The unrest that started outside City Hall impacted a lot of Kansas Cityans. We spoke to one woman who was actually working inside City Hall, April 9th, 1968.
At that time, they did a sit-in at City Hall, and all the departments were ordered to close their doors. It was time to leave, but you left on your choosing. It was at your own risk. But I wasn't afraid. I was ready to go home. I probably would have been with them had I not been an employee of City Hall, because if I had joined them, you know, that would have probably meant my job.
Perez says it was a hectic time. She managed to leave the building, got through the crowd without any problems, and made it home. Coming up, Channel 4 talked to this man in 1968. 50 years later, we talked to him again. How the riots changed Kansas City, his own words.